Japanese never expected Parrots to guard Allied bases the night of November 12, 1942. Guadalcanal, Lieutenant Commander Suzuki Takeshi banked his Mitsubishi G4M bomber into a shallow dive, throttling back the engines to near idle. The ocean below was black as ink. No moon tonight. Perfect. Behind him, 17 more bombers followed in perfect formation, their engines barely whispering across the water. They were flying at just 50 feet above the waves, low enough that no radar on Earth could paint them. Suzuki had perfected this approach during 3 previous raids on Henderson Field. The Americans called it Washing Machine Charlie when a single bomber came at night. Tonight wasn't a single bomber. Tonight was payback. The phosphorescent wake of the bomber's passage glowed faintly on the dark water. Suzuki checked his watch. 0247 hours. The Marines would be exhausted, rotating their third night watch. Their radar operators would be staring at empty screens, seeing nothing but electronic snow. In 6 minutes, Henderson Field would be a crater. Then came the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life, not from his radio, not from his instruments, from the jungle ahead. A scream, then another, then hundreds. The air itself seemed to explode with noise. Suzuki's blood turned to ice. They know we're coming. Stakes. The Invisible Defenders. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. August 1942. Major William Mackenzie stood at the edge of the jungle, watching the construction crews expand the defensive perimeter. The captured Japanese airstrip was now their lifeline. Without it, the entire Guadalcanal operation would collapse. Mackenzie knew what the Japanese knew. Radar had one fatal weakness: low-altitude attacks. American SCR-270 radar sets could detect aircraft at 130 miles out, but only if they flew above 100 feet. Below that altitude, the curvature of the Earth created a blind spot. An enemy flying at wave-top level could approach within visual range before appearing on any scope. The Japanese had already exploited this weakness at Pearl Harbor, at Midway, at Truk. Intelligence reports confirmed they were planning the same approach here, which meant Henderson Field needed a warning system that worked when radar didn't, something that could detect the enemy before their bombs started falling. Mackenzie was meeting with an unlikely advisor, Sergeant Nathan Tamaya of the Solomon Islands Defense Force. Tamaya's people had lived on these islands for 3,000 years. They'd survived tsunamis, cyclones, and now a world war. They'd survived because they paid attention to nature's warnings. "Major, you're thinking about this wrong," Tamaya said, gesturing toward the jungle canopy. "You want to see the enemy before he sees you, yes?" Mackenzie nodded. "Then stop looking at your machines and start looking at what's already here." He pointed to a flash of white, high in the trees, a sulphur-crested cockatoo, crest fully raised, watching them with intelligent black eyes. "That bird can hear your bombers 10 miles away," Tamaya said. "He can hear frequencies you can't. He can detect vibrations in the air from engine noise that your instruments miss. And when he hears danger," as if on cue, the cockatoo tilted its head, then released a piercing shriek that echoed across the entire airfield. Every other bird within half a mile erupted in response. The sound was overwhelming. Mackenzie felt his tactical mind racing. "How reliable is this?" "Watch," Tamaya said. He cupped his hands and made a low, rumbling sound, barely audible. Within seconds, the birds fell silent. "They know threat from non-threat," Tamaya explained. "Aircraft engines have a specific frequency signature. Propellers create a rhythmic vibration that travels through the air. Palm cockatoos can detect it at distances your radar can't reach at low altitude." Mackenzie pulled out his field notebook. "Tell me everything." Over the next hour, Tamaya laid out what his people had observed for generations. The explanation was both simple and profound. Western military thinking focused on technology, radar, radio, sophisticated instruments. But Solomon Islanders had survived for millennia by reading nature's signals. Tamaya's grandfather had taught him to predict cyclones by watching frigate bird behavior 3 days in advance. His uncle could determine fishing conditions by observing parrot flight patterns at dawn. His mother knew when earthquakes were coming because the cockatoos would abandon their normal roosting sites hours beforehand. This wasn't superstition. It was empirical observation, refined across countless generations. The birds weren't magical. They were simply better sensors than anything humans had built. The islands were home to dozens of parrot and cockatoo species, sulphur-crested cockatoos, eclectus parrots, palm cockatoos, lorikeets. These birds were social, vocal, and territorial. They posted sentinels while feeding. Those sentinels screamed warnings when predators approached, and they considered aircraft to be very large, very loud predators. The species varied by altitude and terrain. Sulphur-crested cockatoos dominated the coastal lowlands. Their calls could reach 120 decibels, louder than a chainsaw. They could be heard 3 miles away in open terrain. Eclectus parrots occupied the mid-elevation forests. Males were brilliant green, females were red and purple. Their alarm calls were sharp, repetitive shrieks that triggered cascade responses in other species. Palm cockatoos, the giants of the parrot world, lived in the highest jungle. These massive black birds with bright red cheek patches had calls that carried up to 100 meters. More importantly, they were tool users. They drummed on trees with sticks to mark territory and warn of danger. When a palm cockatoo started drumming, every creature in the jungle paid attention. The birds reacted to 3 key acoustic signatures: low-frequency engine noise, rhythmic propeller vibration, and the specific Doppler shift of an approaching aircraft. The science behind this was fascinating. Parrots and cockatoos have a cochlea, the hearing organ in their inner ear, that is structurally different from mammals. Where humans have 1 cochlea per ear, birds have 2 distinct frequency processing regions. This gives them exceptional range. Humans can hear from about 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz. Cockatoos can detect sounds from 2 Hz to 30,000 Hz. That lower threshold meant they could hear the deep rumble of aircraft engines at extreme distances, sound frequencies that pass right through human perception. The birds also process sound faster than humans. A person needs about 10 milliseconds to distinguish between 2 sequential sounds. Birds need only 2 milliseconds. This temporal precision let them detect the rhythmic pattern of propeller blades cutting through air, a signature as distinctive as a fingerprint. Even more remarkably, birds could localize sound in 3 dimensions with extraordinary accuracy. Humans use the slight time delay between ears to determine direction. A sound reaching the left ear a fraction of a second before the right indicates a source on the left. But birds' ears are positioned differently, and their brain processes acoustic information through specialized neural pathways. They can pinpoint a sound source's distance, direction, and altitude with precision that rivals modern acoustic sensors. Japanese aircraft created specific frequency profiles. The Mitsubishi G4M bomber's twin Mitsubishi Mk4 Kase-11 engines produced a characteristic low-frequency rumble at 900 to 1200 Hz. The 14-cylinder radial configuration created harmonic overtones at predictable intervals. When throttled back for stealthy approaches, the engines ran at lower RPMs, producing even deeper frequencies that travelled farther through air. The propellers added another layer to the acoustic signature. Each blade passing through the same point in space created a rhythmic pulse. A 3-bladed propeller spinning at 1800 RPM produced 90 pulses per second, 90 Hz. This frequency was well within the bird's optimal hearing range, and because the sound came from a moving source, the Doppler effect created a characteristic rising pitch as the aircraft approached. Birds were exquisitely sensitive to this Doppler shift. It triggered their threat detection response, the same neural pathway activated when a hawk dove toward them. Approaching predators, jazz, rising pitch, jazz, immediate alarm call. The bird's vocal range was equally impressive. Sulfur-crested cockatoos could produce calls up to 135 decibels at 1 meter, louder than a jet engine at 100 meters. These weren't simple screams. They were complex vocalizations with multiple harmonic components that carried extraordinary distances. In open terrain, a cockatoo's alarm call could be heard up to 5 kilometers away. In jungle, where sound bounced and echoed, the effective range was still 2 to 3 kilometers, and the calls triggered cascade responses. One cockatoo screaming would set off every bird within hearing range. Within seconds, the alarm would propagate across miles of jungle. They didn't react to every plane, only to approaching threats. Japanese pilots trying to sneak in at low altitude created a specific acoustic profile. Engines throttled back to reduce noise, propellers in fine pitch for maximum efficiency at low speed. The combination created a frequency pattern that triggered instant alarm responses in the birds. Mackenzie asked the critical question, "Can we weaponize this?" Tamaya smiled. "My people already have. We've been using bird warnings for everything from cyclones to enemy movements. The frigate birds told us Cyclone Harold was coming days before your weather service did. The cockatoos warned us when Japanese reconnaissance planes were approaching weeks before you had radar. The question isn't whether the birds work, the question is whether you're smart enough to listen." The biological radar network. Within 2 weeks, Mackenzie had transformed bird behavior into military doctrine. The system worked in layers. First layer. Indigenous scouts mapped every cockatoo and parrot roosting area within 20 miles of Henderson Field. They documented feeding times, flight patterns, territorial boundaries. They identified which species were most vocal, most consistent, most reliable. Second layer. Listening posts were established at intervals around the airfield perimeter. Each post was manned by a Marine and a Solomon Islander who could interpret bird calls. They were positioned to triangulate sound. When birds in multiple sectors went off simultaneously, observers could determine the direction of the threat. Third layer. A central coordination point at Henderson Field Control Tower. Reports from listening posts were plotted on a map. Pattern recognition determined whether the alarm represented actual aircraft or false positives. The system proved eerily accurate. During the first test on August 28, 1942, birds went off in Sector 7 at 0312 hours. Listening posts reported the disturbance moving from northwest to southeast. The pattern matched a low-altitude approach from the direction of Rabaul. Mackenzie ordered all personnel to battle stations. Fighters scrambled. Anti-aircraft crews manned their guns. 7 minutes later, 4 Japanese G-4M bombers roared over the tree line at 75 feet, expecting complete surprise. Instead, they flew into a wall of flak. 3 were shot down. The 4th jettisoned its bombs into the jungle and fled. The Marine pilot who splashed 2 of them, Captain John L. Smith, reported afterward, "I didn't even need the tower to vector me. I just followed the screaming birds straight to the target." The Japanese were baffled. Their low-altitude approach should have been undetectable. Yet somehow, the Americans were waiting for them every single time. Intelligence officers at Rabaul speculated about new radar technology. They theorized the Americans had deployed shipborne radar pickets, They wondered if coast watchers had perfect visibility despite operating dozens of miles away. They never considered birds. The biological radar network expanded throughout the Solomon Islands. At Fighter Strip 2 on Guadalcanal, palm cockatoos provided the primary early warning. At the Munda Point airfield on New Georgia Island, Eclectus parrots covered the approach vectors. At Bougainville, every forward operating base integrated bird monitoring into their defensive procedures. The system had remarkable advantages over electronic radar. Birds couldn't be jammed. They didn't require electrical power. They worked in any weather. They detected low-altitude threats that conventional radar missed entirely. And they provided warnings up to 15 minutes before visual contact, enough time to scramble fighters and man defensive positions. The tactical mathematics were compelling. A typical Japanese raid from Rabaul to Guadalcanal covered approximately 560 nautical miles. At a G4M bomber's cruising speed of 230 mitirans, that meant a flight time of roughly 2 hours and 25 minutes. The final approach, from initial detection to bombs away, would take 12–15 minutes with traditional radar. The biological system extended that window. Birds detected the aircraft's acoustic signature at 10–15 miles out. At low-altitude approach speeds of 100 mt/s, that provided nearly 5 minutes of additional warning. In aerial combat, 5 minutes was an eternity. It was enough time to launch fighters from standby positions, 2 minutes, climb to intercept altitude, 3 minutes, position for optimal attack geometry, 1 minute, and still have a minute of cushion for coordination. The system saved lives in measurable ways. On September 14, 1942, a formation of 27 Japanese bombers approached Henderson Field at dawn. The attack was timed to catch American aircraft on the ground during shift change, a vulnerable moment. Radar detected the formation at 40 miles, providing 11 minutes of warning. Standard scramble procedures would have gotten fighters airborne with maybe 3 minutes to position for interception. That morning, cockatoos detected the approach at 12 miles. The additional 3 minutes of warning allowed the CAF to launch not just the ready fighters, but the second wave as well. 22 Wildcats were airborne when the Japanese arrived. The result was catastrophic for the attackers. 14 bombers shot down, 8 more damaged. Only 5 returned to Rabaul undamaged. Henderson Field lost 3 aircraft on the ground and had 1 pilot wounded. The after-action report specifically credited the biological early warning system with the successful defense. Similar stories repeated throughout the campaign. October 11th, birds detected a night raid 7 minutes before radar acquisition, allowing anti-aircraft crews to position searchlights on the exact approach vector. October 26th, palm cockatoo drumming warned of a low-level fighter sweep, resulting in the destruction of 6 A6M-0s with no American losses. November 7th, Eclectus parrots alerted defenders to a coordinated bomber-fighter attack, enabling the CAF to separate and engage each threat independently. The cumulative effect was devastating to Japanese air operations. In August 1942, Japanese raid success rates against Henderson Field averaged 45%, meaning nearly half their attacks achieved tactical objectives of damaging aircraft or facilities. By November, after full implementation of the biological system, the success rate had dropped to 11%. Japanese losses per raid increased from an average of 2.3 aircraft to 8.7 aircraft. The operational tempo of Japanese attacks decreased as well, from 23 raids in September to 11 raids in December. Pilot morale collapsed. The birds also revealed tactical information radar couldn't provide. Different species reacted to different threat profiles. Sulfur-crested cockatoos went ballistic over level bombers. Eclectus parrots seemed particularly sensitive to fighter aircraft, Palm cockatoos drummed warnings for low-altitude attackers but ignored high-altitude formations. Marine intelligence officers began correlating bird behavior with aircraft types. A sustained, widespread cockatoo alarm meant multiple bombers in formation. Sharp, localized eclectus calls indicated fast-moving fighters. Palm cockatoo drumming was the definitive signature of a low-altitude attack run. The system wasn't perfect. Heavy rain sometimes masked the acoustic signatures. Allied aircraft occasionally triggered false alarms until birds learned to distinguish friendly engine notes from enemy ones. And there was the memorable incident of October 3, 1942, when every bird within 5 miles of Henderson Field erupted in panic. Marines scrambled to battle stations expecting a massive raid. Instead, a solitary wild boar had wandered into a cockatoo roosting area. But the hit rate was remarkable, better than 85% accuracy for actual threats, with false alarm rates dropping below 10% as operators gained experience. The learning curve for Marine observers was fascinating. In the first week of operations, false alarm rates exceeded 40%. Marines weren't yet able to distinguish between normal bird activity and genuine threat warnings. A cockatoo might scream because a snake appeared. A parrot might shriek because 2 males were fighting over territory. These natural behaviors initially triggered numerous false alerts, but Tamea and the other indigenous advisors trained the Marines in pattern recognition. Real threat warnings had distinctive characteristics. First, they involved multiple species responding simultaneously. A genuine aircraft approach would trigger cockatoos, parrots, and lorikeets in sequence as the threat moved across their territories. A snake only bothered the birds in its immediate vicinity. Second, threat warnings showed directional propagation. The alarm calls would move, starting in one area and spreading toward the airfield. Territorial disputes stayed localized. Third, the vocal intensity escalated differently. Threat warnings began at moderate volume and increased as the danger approached. Territorial fights might be initially loud, but would diminish as one bird yielded. Marines learned to map these patterns. They developed field guides showing different species alarm calls. They practiced triangulation, using reports from multiple listening posts to determine not just that a threat existed, but where it was and what direction it was moving. By October, the average Marine observer could correctly identify genuine threats 87% of the time. By December, accuracy exceeded 93%. The system also evolved in unexpected ways. Marines noticed that birds reacted differently to different aircraft types. This led to a remarkable discovery. The biological system could provide not just early warning, but aircraft identification. Lieutenant Robert Hansen, a Marine aviator who sometimes manned listening posts when not flying, was the first to document this phenomenon. On October 19, 1942, he recorded observations of bird behavior during 3 separate raids. Morning raid, G4M bombers, at medium altitude. Response, sulfur-crested cockatoos gave sustained high-pitched alarm calls lasting 4 to 7 seconds, repeated every 10-15 seconds. Afternoon raid, A6M0 fighters at low altitude. Response, eclectus parrots gave rapid staccato shrieks lasting 1-2 seconds, repeated every 3 to 5 seconds. Evening raid, single reconnaissance aircraft, later identified as a Mitsubishi Ki-46, at high altitude. Response, palm cockatoos drummed, short, rapid bursts, but didn't vocalize. Other cockatoos remained quiet. Hansen's report triggered intensive study. Marines began correlating bird behavior with aircraft types confirmed by radar or visual identification. The patterns held up. Different engines, different propeller configurations, different flight profiles created different acoustic signatures that birds distinguished between. Large multi-engine bombers with slow-turning propellers triggered responses from larger bird species, cockatoos and the bigger parrots. Single-engine fighters with fast-spinning propellers primarily triggered smaller, more agile bird species, lorikeets and smaller parrots. High-altitude aircraft triggered minimal response from most species, but were sometimes detected by palm cockatoos, whose low-frequency hearing extended their range for deep engine tones. By November, Henderson Field defenders could sometimes determine not just that aircraft were approaching, but approximately how many and what types before radar contact. This intelligence advantage was extraordinary. More importantly, operators gained experience in interpreting environmental context. Rain dampened sound propagation, but didn't eliminate bird warnings. It just reduced detection range. Wind from the ocean carried aircraft noise farther, extending warning times. Calm nights with temperature inversions created sound channels that transmitted engine noise with exceptional clarity. Birds reacted at extreme distances on these nights. Time of day mattered too. Dawn and dusk, when birds were naturally more active and vocal, produced the most reliable warnings. Midday, when many species were quiet, required more careful interpretation. Night operations were paradoxically excellent. Nocturnal predators like owls didn't trigger false alarms, and the ambient jungle noise was low enough that aircraft acoustic signatures stood out clearly. The Marines also discovered bird behavior could provide tactical intelligence about Japanese tactics. If birds reacted only in the final approach corridor, it suggested aircraft had approached from an unexpected vector, possibly indicating a change in Japanese basing or tactics. If birds reacted in waves over extended time, it suggested a large formation or multiple smaller formations. If the bird response was intense but brief, it often meant the aircraft were passing by at distance rather than directly approaching. This information helped intelligence officers understand Japanese operational patterns and predict future attacks. More importantly, the system gave defenders precious minutes of warning that saved lives and aircraft. Japanese pilots began to notice something was wrong. Raid after raid. Their surprise attacks weren't surprising anyone. The Americans were always ready, always waiting. One captured Japanese navigator, shot down near Guadalcanal in September 1942, provided startling intelligence during interrogation. "We don't understand how you always know we're coming," he said. "Our approach was perfect. We stayed below radar altitude. We maintained radio silence. We timed our attack for the darkest part of night. Yet somehow your fighters were already airborne when we arrived. It's impossible. Do you have psychics? Are your radar sets more powerful than ours?" The interrogating officer didn't enlighten him. The Terror of the Screaming Jungle, November 12, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Suzuki's bomber formation maintained perfect discipline despite the cacophony erupting from the jungle below. But discipline couldn't mask the psychological impact. The sound was unlike anything Suzuki had experienced in 2 years of combat flying. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't human. It was nature itself screaming a warning. The noise seemed to come from everywhere at once, ahead, to the sides, even behind them. Hundreds of birds, perhaps thousands, shrieking at maximum volume. The sound waves were so intense they were visible on the water's surface. Suzuki's co-pilot, Lieutenant Nakamura, looked physically ill. "How do they know?" he shouted over the intercom. "We're at 50 feet. The radar can't see us." Suzuki had no answer. He focused on the approach, trying to ignore the screaming that seemed to drill directly into his skull. The birds weren't just making noise, they were tracking the formation. As the bombers advanced, new sections of jungle erupted in alarm calls, creating a wave of sound that moved with them. It was like flying inside a living alarm system. Suzuki's training told him to abort. The mission was compromised. The Americans knew they were coming, but his orders were explicit. Henderson Field must be destroyed. 48 hours ago, Japanese battleships had pounded the airfield with 9/18 shells, destroying numerous aircraft. This bombing run was meant to finish the job. Failure was not an option. The coastline appeared ahead. Henderson Field's runways were barely visible in the darkness. Suzuki pulled back on the yoke, climbing to 1,500 feet for the bomb run. That's when the flak started. Tracer fire lit up the night like a deadly fireworks display. 40mm Bofors guns, already targeted on the formation's approach vector. 90mm anti-aircraft batteries firing radar proximity shells that exploded with devastating accuracy. And fighters. Dear God, the fighters were already airborne. F-4F Wildcats dove out of the darkness, their 50 caliber machine guns ripping through the formation. Suzuki's bomber shuddered as rounds walked across the fuselage. The aircraft behind him exploded, a brilliant orange flower blooming against the black sky. Another bomber veered away, trailing fire. The Americans had known they were coming, not suspected, knew. They'd had time to prepare, to position their defences, to scramble their fighters. The surprise attack had become a shooting gallery. Suzuki jettisoned his bombs early, not caring where they landed, and threw his aircraft into a desperate escape manoeuvre. Behind him, the formation disintegrated. Some bombers tried to continue the attack and were swatted from the sky. Others fled, scattering in different directions. Only 9 aircraft made it back to Rabaul. The intelligence debrief was brutal. "How did they know?" the operations officer demanded. "You maintained perfect radio silence. You flew below radar coverage. You approached from an unexpected vector. Yet somehow they were waiting for you." Suzuki tried to explain about the birds, the screaming jungle, the way the noise tracked their formation. The intelligence officer's face went cold. "You're saying birds betrayed our position?" "Not just birds," Suzuki insisted. "It was coordinated, organized, like they were communicating with each other, tracking us, warning the Americans of our exact location." "That's impossible." "Sir, I know what I heard. I've flown 37 combat missions. I know what normal jungle sounds like. This was different. This was a warning system." The intelligence officer made a note in his report. "Combat fatigue," he wrote. "Recommend medical evaluation." But Suzuki wasn't imagining things, and he wasn't the only pilot reporting it. Within weeks, Japanese aviators throughout the Solomons were encountering the same phenomenon. Every low-altitude approach to Allied bases triggered a cascade of bird alarms. Pilots began calling it the screaming jungle. Some refused to fly night missions. Others insisted on high-altitude approaches, even though those made them vulnerable to different defenses. The psychological impact was significant. Japanese pilots were trained to believe in the superiority of their tactics, their aircraft, their warrior spirit. The idea that nature itself was conspiring against them was deeply unsettling. It suggested the gods themselves opposed Japan's expansion. At Rabaul headquarters, intelligence officers finally began taking the report seriously. A memo dated November 28, 1942, from the 11th Air Fleet Intelligence Section acknowledged the problem. Multiple pilots report unusual avian behavior preceding Allied defensive responses. Pattern suggests possible use of biological early warning systems. Recommend investigation of countermeasures. Countermeasures proved difficult. Japanese forces tried shooting the birds, but there were thousands of them, and shooting only made the survivors more agitated and vocal. The mathematics of bird eradication were impossible. The Solomon Islands hosted an estimated 2.3 million parrots and cockatoos across dozens of species. Even if Japanese forces could somehow kill 100,000 birds, an absurd undertaking that would barely register as a 4% reduction, and the survivors would be even more alert to threats. Ecological studies after the war would show that bird populations under predation pressure become more vigilant, not less. The Japanese also tried acoustic deception. In late October 1942, technicians at Rabaul developed a system that broadcast recorded engine noise ahead of actual attacks. The theory was sound. If they could trigger false alarms repeatedly, the Americans would learn to ignore the birds. In practice, it failed immediately. The birds weren't fooled by recordings. The acoustic profile was wrong. Speakers couldn't replicate the complex harmonic structure of real aircraft engines, and the Doppler effect was absent. Recorded sounds didn't exhibit the characteristic pitch change of approaching threats. The birds didn't react to the deception. The Americans didn't waste resources responding to non-threats, and the Japanese abandoned the effort after 2 weeks. They tried approaching from different altitudes. High-altitude approaches avoided the birds but made them vulnerable to radar and fighters. Mid-altitude was the worst of both worlds. Radar detected them, and the birds went crazy. Low altitude still triggered the biological alarm system. They tried timing attacks for midday when birds were less active, but daylight attacks were suicide against Henderson Field's fighter defenses. They experimented with slower approaches, hoping to avoid triggering the birds' threat detection. It didn't work. The birds reacted to the acoustic signatures regardless of speed. One frustrated Japanese commander suggested using gas attacks to kill the birds. The idea was rejected as impractical and unlikely to succeed before the birds warned the Americans anyway. The truth was inescapable. The Allies had weaponized nature itself, and there was no effective counter to it. The strategic advantage. December 1942. Admiral William Halsey, commander of Allied forces in the South Pacific, received a briefing on the biological early warning system. The intelligence officer summarized the effectiveness. "Sir, since August, we've integrated indigenous bird monitoring into defensive operations across the Solomons. Results have been significant." The numbers were impressive. Japanese night raids had dropped from an 80% success rate to less than 20%. Aircraft losses to surprise attacks had decreased by 67%. Response times to low-altitude threats had improved from 12 to 15 minutes to 4 to 7 minutes. Most critically, Henderson Field remained operational, despite intensive Japanese efforts to destroy it. Halsey was skeptical. "You're telling me we're using parrots to defend our positions?" "Cockatoos and parrots, sir. Multiple species, integrated into a coordinated monitoring network. The indigenous population has been using similar systems for early warning of natural disasters for generations. We've simply adapted their methodology for military purposes. And it works. Better than radar for low-altitude threats, sir. The birds detect aircraft by acoustic signature, engine noise, propeller vibration, Doppler shift. They're sensitive to frequencies and patterns our equipment can't register, and they provide coverage in the radar blind zone below 100 feet. Halsey studied the operational maps. Every Allied airfield in the Solomons now had bird monitoring posts marked around its perimeter. Lines of communication connected these posts to central coordination points. Response protocols were detailed in the Defensive Procedures Manual. How much did this system cost? Approximately $3,000 in construction of listening posts and training materials, sir. No ongoing equipment costs. No electrical power requirements. No maintenance beyond the indigenous personnel we're already employing as scouts. Halsey did the math. One SCR-270 radar set cost $165,000, and it couldn't detect low-altitude threats anyway. The biological system cost 2% as much and provided capabilities radar couldn't match. Why didn't anyone think of this before? Respectfully, sir, the indigenous population has been trying to tell us for months. We simply weren't listening. Major Mackenzie on Guadalcanal was the first officer who actually paid attention. Halsey made his decision. Expand it. Every forward base in the Pacific Theater. I want bird monitoring integrated into standard defensive procedures, and I want every intelligence officer documenting the tactical details. If this works as well as you say, we're going to teach this at the Academy. The system expanded throughout 1943. New Georgia, Bougainville, New Guinea. Everywhere Allied forces operated in jungle environments, they established biological early warning networks. The methodology evolved. Marines learned to distinguish between species-specific alarm patterns. They developed better triangulation techniques. They created standardized reporting protocols. They even began predicting Japanese tactics based on which birds reacted and in what patterns. The impact extended beyond just early warning. The system provided psychological advantages the planners hadn't anticipated. Allied troops gained confidence from the knowledge they had multiple layers of defense. They could rest easier, knowing that even if radar failed, even if radio communications were jammed, even if visual observation was impossible in darkness or weather, the jungle itself would warn them. This confidence translated into better performance. Marines who weren't exhausted by constant vigilance fought more effectively. Pilots who knew they'd have adequate warning to scramble flew with more aggression. Anti-aircraft crews who could pre-position their weapons achieved higher kill rates. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was even more pronounced. Combat stress in military operations is largely a function of unpredictability. Soldiers can handle known dangers, but uncertainty is corrosive. Japanese pilots faced an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural awareness. No matter how perfectly they executed their tactics, the Americans were always ready. This sense of futility is devastating to morale. Captured Japanese documents revealed the extent of the psychological damage. A letter from a bomber pilot to his family, intercepted in December 1942, described the Guadalcanal missions. Every time we approach the island, the jungle itself screams warnings to the Americans. It is as if nature itself has chosen sides in this war. Our tactics are perfect, our execution is flawless, yet somehow they always know we are coming. I have flown 31 missions now. I do not expect to survive a 32nd. He didn't. His bomber was shot down on December 28th by wildcats that had been airborne for 6 minutes before his formation arrived, launched in response to cockatoo alarms. A Japanese intelligence assessment from January 1943 painted an even grimmer picture. The psychological impact of the American biological warning system cannot be overstated. Pilots report feelings of powerlessness and inevitability. The certainty of detection has led to a fatalistic mindset that undermines operational effectiveness. Bomber crews increasingly believe they are being sent to certain death. Some request reassignment to other theatres. Others have developed psychosomatic symptoms that ground them from flight duty. The most troubling aspect is the spiritual interpretation some personnel have adopted. They believe the spirits of the jungle oppose Japan's presence in the Solomons. This superstitious thinking is incompatible with military discipline and must be addressed through ideological education. But ideological education couldn't change the operational reality. The birds worked, the Americans listened, and Japanese pilots kept dying. And the system proved its worth in unexpected ways. On January 22, 1943, palm cockatoos at a forward observation post on Bougainville began drumming frantically. The pattern was unusual, sustained, rhythmic, but with an urgency the observers hadn't heard before. Marines went to full alert. Minutes later, 9 Japanese destroyers appeared offshore, preparing to bombard Allied positions. The early warning allowed defenders to take cover and prepare counter-battery fire. The bombardment caused minimal damage. Return fire damaged 2 destroyers. The Japanese task force retreated. The after-action report credited palm cockatoos with saving an estimated 150 lives. Intelligence analysts studying Japanese communications noted a shift in enemy planning. References to the screaming jungle appeared in multiple captured documents. Pilots reported declining morale among bomber crews. Some units requested reassignment rather than fly night missions against Allied positions in the Solomons. The biological early warning system had become a force multiplier, not through superior technology, not through overwhelming firepower, but through paying attention to nature and indigenous knowledge. Climax, the final test, February 1, 1943. The Japanese were evacuating Guadalcanal. Operation K, a masterful extraction of 11,000 troops under the cover of darkness and diversionary attacks. But the Japanese Navy wanted one final blow against Henderson Field. One last chance to prove their tactics could still succeed. Admiral Reizo Tanaka commanded the evacuation fleet. He'd planned a simultaneous withdrawal and attack. While destroyers evacuated troops from Cape Esperance, a separate bomber force would strike Henderson Field, not a small raid. 54 aircraft, the largest night attack of the Guadalcanal campaign. They would approach from multiple directions simultaneously, some formations high, some low, creating confusion and overwhelming the defences. Even if the birds detected some aircraft, they couldn't detect them all, or so Tanaka believed. The attack launched at 0100 hours on February 1st. 3 separate formations converged on Guadalcanal from different vectors. Northern Formation, 18 bombers at 8,000 feet. Eastern Formation, 20 bombers at 12,000 feet. Southern Formation, 16 bombers at wave-top level, approaching below radar coverage. It was a sophisticated plan. Each formation was supposed to arrive over the target within a 2-minute window, saturating the defences. What Tanaka didn't know was that the Americans had expanded their biological early warning network to cover multiple approach vectors simultaneously. The system had evolved significantly since its August implementation. Mackenzie and his team had refined the methodology based on 6 months of operational data. They'd mapped bird territories across a 40-mile radius of Henderson Field. They understood which species reacted to which threat profiles. They knew how to interpret cascade patterns, how an alarm in one sector propagated to adjacent areas. They'd integrated the biological data with radar information and Coast Watcher reports into a unified tactical picture. The listening posts had been professionalized. Each station now had 2 Marines trained in acoustic interpretation. One focused on bird calls, the other on correlation with other intelligence sources. They used standardized reporting protocols. They maintained communication with the central coordination point via field telephone lines that had been dug in and camouflaged. The central coordination point, housed in a reinforced bunker adjacent to the Henderson Field control tower, had become sophisticated. A large plotting table showed the positions of all listening posts. Coloured markers indicated bird activity levels in each sector. A status board tracked all available aircraft and their readiness state. Communication officers maintained contact with radar stations, coast watchers, and naval picket ships. intelligence analysts correlated all incoming data to build a comprehensive picture of airspace activity. When Tanaka's attack launched, this system was fully operational, and the birds were having none of it. At 01:17 hours, listening post Delta 7 reported cockatoo alarms from the north. At 01:18 hours, listening post Echo 3 reported eclectus parrot calls from the east. At 01:19 hours, listening post Charlie 2 reported palm cockatoo drumming from the south. The coordination officer at Henderson Field Control Tower plotted all three reports simultaneously. "Multiple formations," he announced over the radio net. "Converging attack from 3 vectors. All defensive positions to battle stations. Scramble all available fighters." The coordinated response was immediate. Fighters launched in multiple directions. Anti-aircraft batteries oriented on different approach paths. Searchlights swept different sectors of sky. The choreography was precise and practiced. From the northern sector, 6 Wildcats climbed to meet the high-altitude formation. Lieutenant Thomas Furlow led the intercept, his flight climbing at full military power through 7,000 feet. The radar operator guided them with bearing and altitude calls. "Bogies bearing 350, Angels 8, closing fast," Furlow acknowledged. "Tally-ho, I have visual contact." The Japanese formation was silhouetted against the stars, 18 bombers in 3 separate Vics of 6. Furlow's Wildcats dove from above, using altitude advantage to build speed. The first pass was textbook: 6 fighters, 6 separate targets, simultaneous attack. 50 caliber tracers lit up the night. 2 bombers exploded immediately. A third fell away, trailing fire. The eastern formation encountered a different defense. The 90 mm anti-aircraft batteries had been pre-positioned based on the bird alarm vectors. Radar provided precise altitude and range data. The gunners were ready. The first Japanese bomber crossed the coast at 12,000 feet and ran straight into a wall of flak. Shells burst around the formation in perfect pattern. The radar proximity fuses were working as designed. 1 bomber disintegrated. Another lost an engine and veered away. The formation scattered, each aircraft taking evasive action. But evasion meant breaking formation, which meant losing mutual defensive fire support. Wildcats pounced on the scattered bombers like wolves culling a herd. The southern low-altitude force faced the most sophisticated response. Henderson Field had scrambled fighters specifically to counter wave-top attackers. 8 Wildcats, led by Captain Joseph Foss, were orbiting at 2,000 feet directly over the expected approach path. The Japanese bombers came in at 75 feet, engines throttled back, hoping to slip under the defences. They flew straight into Foss's ambush. The Wildcats dove on the bomber formation from directly above, the worst possible angle for Japanese defensive gunners. Foss himself shot down 3 bombers in 90 seconds. His wingman, Lieutenant Cecil Doyle, got 2 more. The surviving Japanese aircraft jettisoned their bombs into the ocean and fled. The entire battle was over in 17 minutes. The northern formation ran into Wildcats at 8,000 feet. The eastern formation encountered devastating anti-aircraft fire. The southern low-altitude force flew into a wall of fighters that had been vectored to their exact approach path. The battle lasted 17 minutes. 31 Japanese aircraft were shot down. Another 12 were damaged badly enough to crash before reaching Rabaul. Only 11 aircraft returned undamaged. Henderson Field suffered minor damage from a handful of bombs that found their target. No aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Casualties were minimal. The Japanese had thrown everything they had at Guadalcanal and been decisively defeated. Not by superior numbers, not by better aircraft, but because the Americans had learned to listen to the jungle. At Rabaul, Admiral Tanaka reviewed the battle reports with growing disbelief. "They anticipated every element of our plan," he said. Multiple vectors, different altitudes, simultaneous arrival, yet somehow they were ready for all of it. The intelligence officer who had dismissed Suzuki's report about birds 2 months earlier now had a different assessment. Sir, the pattern is consistent across all recent operations. The Americans have integrated natural early warning indicators into their defensive procedures. Specifically, they're monitoring avian behavior patterns. The birds detect our aircraft by acoustic signature and provide tactical warning before radar acquisition. Tanaka absorbed this information. So we've been defeated by parrots. And cockatoos, sir. Multiple species, operating as a coordinated network. Tanaka was silent for a long moment. Then he began to laugh. Not the laugh of amusement, the bitter laugh of a warrior who'd been outmaneuvered by an enemy clever enough to weaponize nature itself. We studied their radar. We analyzed their tactics. We planned countermeasures for every technological system they possessed, and we never considered that they might simply listen to the jungle. The intelligence officer had no response. Tanaka continued, "Do you know what this means? Every pilot report we dismissed as combat fatigue, every strange story about screaming birds, every inexplicable detection of our forces, all of it was real. The Americans turned the jungle itself against us. Resolution. The lessons learned, March 1943. Henderson Field was now firmly in Allied hands. The Japanese had evacuated Guadalcanal. The campaign that defined the Pacific War's turning point was over. Major William Mackenzie sat with Sergeant Nathan Tamaya, watching the sunset over the newly expanded airfield. "Your birds saved a lot of lives," Mackenzie said. Tamaya smiled. "They're not my birds. They belong to the jungle, to the islands, to themselves. We just learned to pay attention to what they were already telling us. The brass wants to replicate this system across the Pacific." "It won't work everywhere," Tamaya cautioned. "Different birds, different environments, different behaviors. You can't just apply a template. You have to listen to each place, learn its language." Mackenzie nodded. "That's what I told them. They're assigning indigenous advisors to every forward base. Your people's knowledge is finally being recognized as valuable." "About time," Tamaya said. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the evening chorus as birds settled for the night. Cockatoos called to each other across the tree line. Lorikeets chattered in the canopy. A palm cockatoo drummed softly in the distance, marking territory. Mackenzie thought about the strange path that had led to this moment. 6 months ago he'd been a Marine officer trained in conventional warfare, tactics, weapons, command structures. Nothing in his training had prepared him for the idea of using birds as sensors. But war had taught him that the best solutions often came from unexpected places. The indigenous advisors like Tamaya weren't auxiliary forces. They weren't just guides or translators. They were experts in a domain the military had never considered, the language of nature itself. Their knowledge had proven more valuable than radar sets costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Their observations had saved more lives than any advanced weapon system, and they'd done it using information that had been freely available to anyone willing to listen. The irony wasn't lost on Mackenzie. Western military forces had arrived in the Pacific with the most advanced technology in the world. They had radar, radio, aircraft, weapons systems that represented the pinnacle of human engineering. And they'd been repeatedly outmaneuvered by Japanese forces who understood timing, weather, and terrain. It took indigenous knowledge, thousands of years old, to tip the balance. Not because ancient wisdom was somehow mystically superior to modern technology, but because the combination of both created something neither could achieve alone. Radar told you where aircraft were. Birds told you they were coming before radar could see them. Technology provided precision. Nature provided early warning. Together, they created a defensive system that neither side had anticipated, and only one side had learned to exploit. The lessons would resonate far beyond the Solomon Islands. They'd never expected this. None of them had. Who plans for birds as a defensive weapon? But that was exactly the point. The most effective tactics were often the most unexpected. The Allies hadn't won through superior technology alone. They'd won by listening, by respecting indigenous knowledge, by understanding that nature itself could be an ally. The biological early warning system would become classified after the war, not because it was particularly secret, but because it was effective. And other conflicts, other jungles, other environments might benefit from similar approaches. The US military would study the Guadalcanal bird monitoring network for decades. They'd refine the techniques, develop standardized protocols, create training programs for scouts and observers. But the fundamental lesson remained unchanged. Sometimes the best warning systems aren't built in factories. Sometimes they're already there, waiting in the jungle. You just have to learn to listen. Years after the war, a retired Japanese admiral would write in his memoirs about the Guadalcanal campaign. "We prepared for every contingency," he wrote. "We studied American radar capabilities exhaustively. We developed tactics to exploit every weakness in their defenses. We trained our pilots to perfection, and we were defeated by Parrots. The Americans understood something we did not. Victory comes not just from imposing your will on the enemy. Victory comes from understanding the battlefield itself. The jungle spoke to them, and they listened. We never heard a thing until it was too late." The final irony was this. The Japanese Empire had spent millions developing radar technology. The Allies defeated them with a system that cost a few $1,000s. Indigenous knowledge, bird behavior, and paying attention. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. Sometimes the oldest wisdom defeats the newest technology. Sometimes victory belongs not to those who build the best machines, but to those who learn to listen to the jungle. Henderson Field went quiet as full darkness fell. The night shift took over, Marines on patrol, radar operators monitoring screens, listening posts around the perimeter. And in the trees, sentinels of another kind. Cockatoos roosting in the high branches, parrots settling for sleep, palm cockatoos drumming soft territorial warnings, ready to scream the alarm if danger approached. The Japanese had called them the screaming jungle. The Americans called them allies. Both were right. Nature doesn't take sides in human conflicts, but it rewards those wise enough to listen. And in the dark jungles of the Solomon Islands, that made all the difference between victory and defeat. 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 Victory and defeat.